Welcome to our podcast, Tis But a Scratch, fact and fiction about the Middle Ages. Today, we're going to be talking about a movie. The movie is The Northman. I'm delighted to have as my co-host for this episode, my old friend and colleague, Dr. Christine Senecal. Hi, Chrissy. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Thank you very much, Richard. I feel very lucky that you invited me to join you on your podcast. And I know Richard from a long time ago. So I'm Chrissy Senecal. I'm an associate professor of history at Shippensburg University. It's a mid-sized state university in south central Pennsylvania. And my specialties are in medieval history, topics that include gender and warfare and aristocratic culture. I recently am also interested in big history, and my main scholarly development as of late is my history Instagram project. So if you would like to listen, you can follow me at chrissysenecal.com. And I received my PhD from Boston College. I was tutored under Professor Robin Fleming, who is a close friend of Richard. And it was during that time that I met you. And
yes,
you were gracious enough to serve on my dissertation committee. And I was a big fan of your scholarship from the very start of my career.
Aww.
Yeah. So your work on the English aristocracy before the Norman conquest was super important to my dissertation.
And the dissertation was an excellent dissertation. I felt fortunate to be on that committee. And I feel fortunate to have you on this podcast because my loving wife and my usual co-host, Ellen, refused. She just refused. And where marriage will survive this, I think. But we do have a mixed marriage. I love movies, and she finds them too intense. And The Northman turns out to be a pretty intense film.
It's pretty epic. It's pretty metal.
I should begin with a warning. This episode will have spoilers. If you haven't seen The Northman, you might want to watch it first and then come back to our podcast. As our listeners know, I divide movies about the Middle Ages into 4 categories: the good, the bad, the not so bad, and the downright ugly. Yeah.
Excellent.
And The Northman is one of the few movies that I would place in the category of good medieval films, by which I mean a movie that tries to capture the authentic spirit of the age.
I have to say, I think it's my favorite medieval film. And that's saying something, because there's a lot of good ones out there, but and if you have 2 medievalists who are movie geeks that give it good ratings, that's something.
The popularity of Vikings at least goes back to 1958 with the release of the movie The Vikings with Kirk Douglas, Tony Curtis. I mean, I still can't get over the idea of Tony Curtis as a Viking.
Right.
Ernest Borgnine and Janet Leigh as a beautiful Welsh princess. That movie is a swashbuckler. Movie critic Philip Scheuer described it as, quote, a kind of Prince Valiant without the prince. It is filled with pell-mell action that the adult eye will follow with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Nobody involved in the making of the Vikings believed that this would be taken seriously. It was meant to be a popular, fun movie that would make a lot of money, and that's precisely what it did. Robert Eggers, the director and co-screenplay writer for The Northman, had grander ambitions. He wanted to make an epic movie about Vikings that was faithful to the sensibility of the sagas, and I think he succeeded. The very different intentions of the movie makers can be heard in the musical themes for these 2 films. The musical score for the Vikings was composed by Mario Nascimbi, and it's lushly romantic. It recalls the 1930s Warner Brothers swashbucklers with music by Eric Korngold. The second is from the movie The Northman. The composers are Robin Carolyn and Sebastian Gainsborough. It features native Icelandic medieval instruments, and their intention was to reproduce the harsh, dissonant, brutal world of the film. And I think they succeeded.
I absolutely agree with you. We were talking before, and it is the saga ethos, but the heroic journey of an epic. So it kind of meshes the genres in some ways.
Exactly. It has the linearity of plot development of an epic. It avoids all of the tangents of the sagas, but it has the tone and the characterization and worldview of the 13th century sagas. The Northman is obviously the work of people who love the saga genre. Eggers became interested in doing a film about Vikings after he made a trip to Iceland with his wife in 2016, which is when Eggers met Jean, the Icelandic lyricist, poet, and novelist who would collaborate with Eggers on the screenplay for The Northman. Alexander Skarsgård, who plays Hamlet, the protagonist of The Northman, was also interested in doing a movie about Vikings. He himself had played a vampire Viking in the TV show True Blood. As Skarsgård points out in an interview, the character he played in True Blood, Eric Northman, was a prince out for revenge against the man who destroyed his family, not unlike the character that he plays in The Northman. In an interview, Skarsgård said, "I want to credit True Blood a little, at least for giving me that idea. I was kind of harboring this idea, this dream of one day making an epic Viking movie, but in a truly authentic way that would capture the essence of the old Icelandic sagas and the poetry, that stark, laconic, harsh world in characters and tone. But it was a distant dream 10 years ago." End quote. And when Skarsgård met Eggers in 2017 to discuss a possible project together, they began to bond over Viking sagas. As Skarsgård tells it, quote, "The Northman is about fate, and it was fated that we should work together. I was with Lars Knudsen, the Danish producer, who had just worked with Rob on The Witch, and Lars and I were trying to figure out the perfect Viking story to tell. We're going through the old sagas and trying to decide which one to base our Viking movie on. And then I met Rob about something else, and he had just returned from Iceland, where he had dinner with Björk and Jean, the Icelandic poet, author, musician, Renaissance man. Rob had fallen in love with Iceland, the people, the culture, and was really into Norse mythology. I mentioned that I was trying to make a Viking movie, and Rob got fired up and started talking about different ideas. We ended up spending the entire lunch just talking about Vikings. Leaving the meeting, it just felt inevitable. I called Lars and told him about the meeting, and Lars was like, 'Rob is a genius. He's amazing to work with. Of course we should ask if he wants to join us and try to do this together,' and so we did." End quote. Robert Eggers' hallmark as a filmmaker is his almost fanatical attention to historical detail. This is clearly evident in two earlier movies, The Lighthouse and The Witch, and it's equally true for The Northman. In an interview, Robert Eggers explained that in The Northman, he was world building. The insane notion, as he put it, of recreating the past, he quote, "It's impossible, especially for an era from 1,000 years ago, but it gives me and my collaborators a North Star. We were lucky to be working with leaders in the field of Viking studies to advise on this. I'm sure historians will find plenty of things to pull apart, and in 10 years, it'll all be moot. But there's never been a Viking movie as focused on accuracy as this one." End quote.
I agree. The movies just, I think it is the world building where it really succeeds in the spiritual representation, the shamanic aspects that it emphasizes, and in general the material culture. It's just those are two areas that are very, very strong, and Robert Eggers had the budget to make them worthy, I think.
It really helps that Eggers had good historical consultants and paid attention to them. These were Dr. Neil Price, an archaeologist at the Uppsala University, folklorist Terry Gunnell at the University of Iceland, and historian Johanna Katrin Friðriksdóttir of the National Library of Norway in Oslo, and author of Valkyrie, The Women of the Viking World. Of the three, I'm most familiar with the work of Neil Price, whose book, The Viking Way, Magic and Mind in Late Iron Age Scandinavia, is a bold attempt to understand the Viking worldview, the Viking mind, based upon literature and material artifacts.
Yeah, really trying as much as possible to see the Viking culture as peeled back, divorced from the Christian lens that the sagas really put on Viking culture.
Yes. So it's not just simply doing the mythology. What it's really trying to do is get a sense of what the belief system really was. It's much more shamanistic than the Viking mythology would have us believe. It's not Marvel Comics.
No, and gee, that stuff is really fun. I mean, I love mythology, of course, but it's usually a lot of times this sort of way it's represented in pop culture does tend to be Marvel, and it's flat, as though it's unchanging, and there's a pantheon with clearly defined boundaries.
And it's a religion which doesn't seem to have religion in it.
Right.
Which is, and what Neil Price is recovering is the belief system. A belief system of a people who were essentially a farming people as well as people who went raiding. So
yeah, absolutely.
Nature is all important in this system.
Yes, and on the one hand, I think you mentioned the ethics. On the other hand, the importance of ritual in religion. That's something that I'm always trying to stress to my students, because in American culture, whatever our non-religious or religious background, it's so Christian cerebral. It's like from a book, and that is the idea of what religion is. It's like, what's the theology?
Certainly true for American Christians and for the wider audience for this film. Less true for Hasidic and other Orthodox Jews and for Hindus. Both of those religions emphasize orthopraxy and ritual, though the movie's rituals probably would strike neither group as having anything to do with what they would recognize as religion.
Exactly. And instead, a lot of what people have really attached as what's religion has been around rituals. And
yes.
Yeah, and I think this film does that really.
I think it does as well. I was impressed by the range of sources that I could footnote in this film, both archaeological sources and literary sources. Although the narrative itself is loosely based upon Saxo Grammaticus's story of Hamlet, the source material for Shakespeare's Hamlet, Eggers also draws upon the Poetic Edda and Prose Edda and a number of sagas such as Egil's sagas, Grettis saga, the Eyrbyggja saga, and the saga of Rolf Kraki as material for the mentality, the world that he was trying to create in this film. Honest that he also was thinking in terms of Conan the Barbarian.
Oh, right. That was like the element of his youth that he could remember that he liked about. Yeah. But I also think he used a lot of material culture, like the tree, that motif that appears throughout the film from the Oseberg ship burial.
Yes.
And a lot of the archaeology, like the houses, for example. They're
everything is an attempt to get it right.
Yeah.
And credit for this really needs to go to the production designer, Craig Lathrop, and to the costume designer, Linda Muir. From ships to houses to helmets, costumes, all were attempts to get it right, to be late 9th, early 10th century.
Yeah.
And if there is a real criticism from a historian's point of view of the movie, is that the material world is really set in, it's supposed to begin, 895, and it continues to about 915. The material world really is that period.
Right.
The ethical world seems to me to be partly that period and partly the period of the sagas,
Sure.
which are 13th century,
Yeah. Absolutely.
looking back upon the earlier period.
Right. The kind of lens of the vengeance motif as the sagas portray
As the
it.
sagas portray it. So I think it's a hybrid between the saga
Yeah.
and the attempt to be able to recreate a world of, a Scandinavian world of the early 10th century.
Yeah. Which is, I think, it's merit too. Like, for example, if I was to use it in a teaching classroom, even thinking about having people pick out, well, what elements are like the saga, like the kennings, the wordplay that are constantly being used in the script. War Raven is King Arvandil, and things like that. That's saga. And then what isn't is interesting too to think about.
Well, my favorite of the Kennings is Fjolnir the Brotherless.
Oh, yeah.
He's brotherless because he killed his brother.
Right.
which I love.
Yeah.
But every one of the major characters has a nickname,
Right.
to distinguish them. So you have King Ovendil, the War Raven. You have Thora the Proud, and Forthinner Tooth Gnasher. I mean, these are great names.
They are really great.
And they're the type of names you get in sagas.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm really impressed by Egger's world building and his attempt to capture the Viking mind. The only movie that I would actually put up next to it in terms of attempts to be accurate was an Icelandic film made in 1981 called The Outlaw, based upon the saga of Gisli the Outlaw, which doesn't have the epic scope of this movie, but was really an attempt to be faithful to the saga genre. The Northman is not nearly as faithful to its main source, the story of Prince Amleth, which appears in the Gesta Danorum, The Deeds of the Danes, a work written by a Danish historian, Saxo Grammaticus, in the early 13th century. Amleth sounds like Hamlet for a reason. That is Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. In the story, Amleth is the son of a king, a great warrior king, who is killed by Amleth's uncle, the brother of the king, so that he can marry Amleth's mother, the queen. Sound familiar?
Should be.
Yeah, because it's the basic plot for Disney's The Lion King. Anyway, in Saxo Grammaticus' story, Amleth gets his vengeance by pretending to be crazy and therefore harmless. His madness and his simplicity, the fact that he comes over as a fool, is a disguise which allows him to bide his time and plan the vengeance that he will eventually take upon his uncle. As he explains to his mother, Garutha, I wear this zany appearance for my own benefit, as I've no doubt whatever that the ruffian who can kill his own brother is likely to savage his other kinsmen with equal ferocity. That's why I prefer to put on the behavior of an imbecile instead of a purposeful sanity, and borrow safe cover by looking like an out-and-out maniac. Yet in my heart there is this persistent yearning to avenge my father, and I'm on the watch for opportunities, always waiting for the right moment. There are different times for different undertakings. Against a secretive and pitiless mind, deeper machinations have to be employed. End quote.
So he's really a trickster figure in Saxo.
He's like Loki.
Right.
Saxo Grammaticus emphasizes the trickster element by having Amleth always tell the literal truth, which is always misinterpreted as being a sign of his madness. Unlike Shakespeare's Hamlet, Saxo Grammaticus' story of Amleth ends happily. The prince manages to get all of his uncle's retainers dead drunk, covers them with a tapestry, fastens it to the ground so that they can't get up, sets fire to the palace, and he then stabs his uncle to death. His mother is recalled to virtue, and he succeeds to the throne. And that has almost nothing to do with the movie, right?
Agreed.
Well, I'm going to ask Chrissy to just simply give a synopsis so that we know what this film is about.
Absolutely. So thank you, IMDb. This is like hashed from you. I think that two of the main characters don't have names or proper names. They're ideas, and the two ideas are fate and vengeance.
Yes.
And both of these play the main roles, really. And they're both sad. They're both incredibly problematic because they are the driving force of the action and they don't lead to happiness. They lead to a lot of pain. So I think that's the umbrella.
Which I think is, again, very much true to this Viking conception of the world. The world is not a pleasant place. Any religion which is going to culminate in Ragnarok with the destruction of everything is not a happy religion.
No. Right. Valhalla, is just like a little episode. It's not the total picture.
No.
Absolutely. Yeah, so King Arvandil at the beginning returns home. I wrote it down. Rafnsey, sorry.
Yes.
So his queen Guthrun is there, his son Amleth is there, and as he's greeted, you think that the family's going to be reunited in happiness. Very early on, King Arvandil has a ceremony of adult initiation with his son Amleth. And I really feel like you named it like
a werewolf bar mitzvah. And alas, I can't claim credit for it.
It's Roberta Onion, right?
Rebecca Onion used that characterization in an interview that she did with Robert Eggers for Slate. Yes,
Yeah.
Which I think is almost perfect.
It really is. It's great. So we mentioned it because we'll talk about it probably later. But so very soon after that, though, King Arvandil's evil brother Fjolnir slaughters him, ravishes Queen Guthrun, and is going to try to kill Amleth. But Amleth has been initiated into a vow of trying to save his mother, avenge his father, and kill his uncle.
And he does this mantra as he rows away to safety. He keeps repeating,
I will avenge you, father! I will save you, mother! I will kill you, Fiona! I will avenge you, father! I will save you, mother! I will kill you, Fiona! I will avenge you, father! I will save you, mother! I will kill you, Fiona!
Having that as a mantra that he has to obey and being unable to come to terms with maybe the nuances of his situation.
Their nuances? Never mind.
Is what brings tragedy, I think, ultimately. So what he does is eventually he makes his way to an area of where the Rus Vikings live.
Yes.
And he becomes a berserkir. So there he's engaging in all kinds of violence.
Yeah, over-the-top violence. In a raid on a Slavic village, he acts like a killing machine.
Just to keep it short, because I'm sure we can return to it, he sees it. He finds a seeress who tells him his destiny is to kill Fjolnir. He ends up becoming, on purpose, a slave, so that he can sneak into Fjolnir's lands.
Who's now in Iceland, having lost his kingdom.
Right, he's a refugee,
but a pretty wealthy refugee. He's the owner of a large farm worked by many slaves, and the master of several warrior retainers. He's no longer a king, and it is a real come-down, but he's probably what the Icelanders would have called a Gothar, an Icelandic big man.
There he meets a fellow slave named Olga, and
who's a Slav.
Exactly.
And a witch.
Exactly. They have sexy time. And also, she's inimical to the plot because she helps him to wreak unholy vengeance. I guess we can't use the word holy because it's not Christian. But they eventually, Olga uses fly a Garrick. Is that how you say flyageric?
Yeah,
flyageric. Yeah, to
magic mushrooms.
Right, to poison their enemies. The Fjolnir ends up being killed in an epic battle at the end with Hamlet on the gates of hell, which is on a big volcano, but not before Queen Guthrum has tried to kill her own son Hamlet.
Yeah, the big reveal in this is that Gudrun, who we keep on thinking for as having been a victim, turns out to be the instigator of the entire story. She seduced her brother-in-law, persuaded her brother-in-law to kill her husband, and instead of being ravished and taken away, she was the willing accomplice of this, and was also willing to have her son Amleth killed.
Yeah.
She's not a nice lady.
She's not, although I'm not totally sold that she was the one that instigated it as much as took an opportunity where it lay in a really brutal way. She
points out to Amleth at the big reveal that she herself had been a slave, that she had been raped by his father. He is the product of rape, and that
she wants them both dead.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she wants them both dead. And she then apparently tries to seduce her son. And since it's Nicole Kidman, it's not a bad seduction technique.
But it induces extreme horror on the part of Amleth.
And also the audience.
And the audience, exactly.
And she's not really a seduction because she's really going to get close enough to him to be able to stab him.
Yeah.
Gudrun obviously loves her young son Gunnar, her son by Fjolnir, but she just as obviously views her older son as a threat that must be disposed of. At the end of the movie, she will try again to kill Amleth, who in self-defense will kill her. Amleth will also kill his half-brother in self-defense, after Gunnar leaps on his back, repeatedly stabbing him in a vain and, given Amleth's earlier mantra, really ironic attempt to save his mother. This sets up the final set-piece Holgang, the duel to the death between Amleth and Fjolnir at the gates of hell, the crater of the Icelandic volcano Hekla, which was foreshadowed in the movie's opening sequence. Yeah. It's not a happy family.
No, it is not. It is not. Mm-mm.
No. And it's not a happy movie, although in terms of maybe the sagas and maybe even 10th century Scandinavia, it is happy because our hero Amleth will get his vengeance.
Right.
He will also go to Valhalla. We know this because the last thing he sees is a Valkyrie coming to take him.
Right.
The Valkyrie, by the way, is not a beautiful lady. Valkyrie is a pretty scary woman.
Pretty terrifying.
Pretty terrifying, with the etched teeth and dyed blue teeth of Vikings.
Yeah, which was a thing.
Yeah. And we know that his new wife, Olga, who's going to the safety of his kinsmen in the Orkneys,
right,
that she will bear him a daughter whom he knows from the prophecy of the seeress is destined to be a maiden king.
Exactly.
So fate plays its way out in this. It's all fated from the very beginning. This is how it has to end.
Yeah, and if there's any kind of sort of positive or do we want to say uplifting moment, Amleth seems unable to break away from his fate, and he does manage to get it all. He gets to choose both the love of his kinsmen, that is his Olga and their children, and also get vengeance, which he just can't. He can never stop that. And
he gets the vengeance because of the love of his kinsmen. He can't leave behind Fjolnir,
right,
because Fjolnir will now take vengeance upon him for the death of his son, right, whom Amleth has killed. By the end of the movie, he'll have killed both of Fjolnir's sons.
Right, Gunnar and Thordur.
So he's killed both of their sons. Right. If he leaves Fjolnir alive, he knows that his children will be hunted down.
Yeah.
So he has to finish. He has a good reason.
It's not just only for, like, overdone courageousness. Yeah.
The irony is that for the sake of the Slavic woman Olga, Amleth is willing to forego the sworn vengeance of a Viking. But because of his love of Olga and because of his concern for his unborn children, he is forced nonetheless to fulfill that vengeance. To put it another way, he's fated to complete the story.
Absolutely. I think the world building here just works so well because this kind of very tough civilization where really cruel fate that you can't escape and the rules of vengeance, they don't even relax their grip for the so-called hero, the protagonist of the movie.
No, they don't. But it's incredibly moral film because of this. Amleth is compelled by an ethical pledge to avenge his father.
Yeah.
He doesn't have a real choice about this. He won't be a good man unless he does this.
Right. I also really thought that Robert Eggers did just a great job at both presenting that moral lens of the Viking world and layered with it without it's show don't tell in terms of the modern viewer and being allowed to be repelled by that, like repelled by the amount of slavery that exists in this world and the amount of brutality. It's not presented in a way that soft pitches it at all.
No, not at all. The slaves are presented as chattel. If they're not going to be fit, they'll be disposed of. Mm-hmm. That slave women can be casually raped.
Oh, yeah.
Olga is on the verge of being raped when she forestalls it by indicating that she's menstruating.
Yeah.
The taboo about menstruation is apparently an invention of
one wishes we had more information on that, but reaching down, grabbing her menstrual blood, and then slapping her would-be rapist shoulder. That's pretty epic there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, it's Thorfinn, the son, the proud.
Oh, was there Thorfinn? Yeah, sorry.
Who's going to be doing the raping. And he just simply goes on to somebody else. He treats it as his right to do this. Yeah.
And that does remind me of the, the writing of Ibn Fadlan. Because that's, one of the most famous sort of primary sources that people like to read to look at Viking culture in the area of the Rus. And there's some pretty horrible scenes where Ibn Fadlan is remarking on the lack of modesty of these Vikings, that they just have sex openly.
Like animals.
Like animals. And we talk about that in my classes because I assume that what's happening is that they're slave women that are being raped.
Yes, because if it's a free woman, the rules are completely different. No. One of the paradoxes is that the Scandinavian society for this early Middle Ages gives more rights to free women than most of its contemporary societies would. They are property owners. They are law-worthy.
This is like the Irish in the early medieval period, I feel like, which was also a slave-owning society. And if you showed your status because you weren't a slave. And something that I always think about when I'm teaching history is the motive that runs across human time, I think, in whatever social groups people are in, to try to be specialer. And if you're specialer because you show that you're not a slave, you can hold weapons in public. You can go to a legal court.
And our hero, Amleth, proves himself even as a slave to be special by being an exceptionally good ball player in the really brutal form of lacrosse or field hockey. Yeah. It's probably more like field hockey than anything. Knotlike.
Yeah, that's how I was hearing it. Knotlike.
Yeah. It's a ball game. It's the ball game that is described in Ael's saga.
Right.
In which Ael loses his temper, ends up killing another kid.
And everybody's like, good job.
Yeah. His mother says, you're going to make a great Viking.
Right.
Yeah. And Amleth rescues his half-brother. He knows it's his half-brother. Nobody else does. The kid is about to be killed as he lay on the ground, which is apparently fair in Knotlike. It actually would have helped to have had the rules of the game explained.
Yeah.
The would-be killer, Thorfinnr Toothgnasher, raises his club to bash Gunnar's skull in when Amleth rushes over and strikes Thorfinnr dead. This act of courage and prowess wins him the favor of his uncle. Of course, his uncle doesn't know that the slave is actually Amleth, whom he ordered to be killed 20 years earlier and who he believes is long dead, and who is now intent upon taking vengeance upon him.
Right. And isn't it Thorir that actually allows Amleth to choose a woman? And so,
yes,
as his reward, and Amleth, of course, picks Olga.
Olga is one of the two female characters in the film. She's an essential character because Amleth will not be able to get his revenge without her help. A criticism of the Northman on another medieval popular culture podcast, Media Eval, a really good pun, is that the character of Olga is left completely undeveloped. The actress Anya Taylor-Joy does a really good job playing Olga of the Birch Forest, but I have to agree that the part is underwritten. We don't know anything about her besides the fact that she's a Slavic witch woman.
Right.
But we don't know a backstory.
Right.
And we don't know what attracts her to Amleth. Amleth is attracted in part because she's useful to him for the vengeance.
I mean, she can, at some points, Amleth could be useful to her as protection, too.
Yeah. Let's face it, they're also the best looking slaves.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, what the movie is particularly good on, and I think brave about, is rituals that, if it's not put into the context of the movie, if you just see it on the internet alone, look intensely silly.
Sure. Yeah, being inhabited by animal spirits after taking hallucinogenic mushrooms, yeah.
The first example of this is what we called Amleth's werewolf bar mitzvah. King Ovendal brings his 12-year-old son into a temple. They descend stairs into an underground cavern. Ovendal orders Amleth to imitate him as they both go down on their hands and knees and act like wolves or dogs. In this way, they scamper into a chamber where they encounter a man in an animal mask. This man turns out to be Hamir the Fool, though in context he's now Hamir the Wise, played wonderfully by Willem Dafoe. I probably should have said this before, but let me take a few minutes to say it now. The movie is really well cast. This is true for the main characters, Alexander Skarsgård as Amleth, Claes Bang as Fiona, Nicole Kidman as Queen Gudrun, Anya Taylor-Joy as Olga, and it's true for the smaller roles, especially Willem Dafoe as Hamir, Ethan Hawke as King Ovendil, and Bjork as the Seeress. Okay, now that I've done due diligence, let's get back to the ritual. And they're on their hands and their feet, they're howling, they're barking, they're proving that they're not dogs, but they're wolves, and then they have to prove that they're men, and they do it by burping and farting.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, showing that, like, what makes us men, or them men, is something that's base, too. Yeah.
After King Ovendal burps and then turns to Amleth, and Amleth farts, his father says to him, what does he say to him?
I smell a good pupil.
I smell a good pupil, yeah.
Amleth farts, yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny and it's silly, but they take it intensely seriously, and it's a prelude to a vision.
Yeah. All of this, I really like how it's dealt with as liminalness, which is about what shamanistic religion is. Yeah. So, is it this world or is it another world? Is the leading shaman a fool or is he a wise man? Are they men or are they, wolf?
And Hamir is both the fool and the wise man.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, and it really is great.
Yeah.
The liminality of the wise fool is clear in the scene in which Fiona enters the court of his brother and greets the king and queen as they sit on their thrones. Hamir is the only one insightful enough to suspect the illicit relationship between Fiona and Gudrun. When Queen Gudrun offers her cup to Fiona, Hamir the Fool says, "Look how the queen's cup grows wet for more men than her king. What metal might buy a fragrant sip, sweet silver or hot iron?" Fiona yells out, "Silence, dog! By Freya, you slander your lord and mistress." But King Orvendal responds, "Please, you brother, 'tis but a jest, a jest. Hamer keeps a foul tongue, yet I keep him as a deep sworn friend."
Right. Like fools in the Central Middle Ages, they were supposed to be figures that told the truth but could get away with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This jest is going to end up costing Hamer his life. He'll be decapitated by Fjolnir. And Amleth will only learn this in a very odd way when he is seeking a weapon to be able to do his vengeance. He consults a Saith Mather, witch man, and the witch man has as his aid to the spirit world the mummified head of Hamer. So Hamer doesn't even shut up when he's dead.
Yeah.
The other ritual highlighted in the film is the berserkir ritual.
Oh, yeah.
And this is, I think, very much Neil Price, who wrote about ecstatic dancing and about the idea of Setha, of magic, in which you could channel the spirit of animals.
Yeah.
It's not literally becoming a werewolf or a werebear,
Right.
but what it is being possessed by the spirit
Right.
of the wolf and the spirit of the bear.
Right, right. And that shows a lot about the kinds of social views of the natural world, I think,
Yes.
were. I think if you look across human cultures, it's a kind of consistent line that humans want to draw between human and non-human, and playing with that is, on the one hand, it almost is a recognition that line can be crossed, and that there's not really this line after all of specialness between human and animal.
Yes.
And sometimes it's something you want, and sometimes it's something that you ridicule and hate. Yeah.
When I first saw it, I thought to myself, I'm watching the practice of a Chippendale strippers for a bachelorette as they go ahead and they dance together. But it is an attempt to show that they are leaving their own personalities, their own bodies, and becoming part of that natural world.
Right. A world that allows for breaking away from the social norms where you don't just kill people and rip them to shreds and make them bleed and be in pain.
And so you don't have to have guilt, because this is not you who's doing this.
Right.
You have become something beyond human.
Yeah, and
doing it.
there's so many war rituals across time where that ritual behavior before battle takes place.
And what the movie wants to do is, the movie is making an interpretation. The berserker is a difficult character in Norse sagas, and historians are really divided. There are historians who say this is a fictional creation of the sagas.
Right.
And in the later sagas, berserkers are villains. They're almost always villains. The hero is going to face a berserker and kill the berserker.
Right.
Berserkers rape women. Berserkers are just evil in the late sagas. The earlier berserkers are more ambiguous figures. What they do share throughout is that they have a bloodlust.
Yeah.
Now the question is, what exactly is a berserker?
Right.
The word itself in Old Norse is difficult because it can mean two very different things. The bear part of it could either mean that you are going into battle without armor, without a shirt.
Right, you're bare.
Yeah. The zerka part is shirt.
Right.
The other possibility is that it refers to the animal, the bear.
Right.
And that you're either going into battle with a bear skin on, or you're going into battle channeling a bear, the spirit of the bear.
Right, and somehow being vulnerable.
Wearing the bear.
Right.
Yeah.
I also like the idea that it's both, even at the time.
No, and I think so, and it doesn't have to make a choice.
Right.
We want to somehow say there's an etymology here, but the thing about this Norse society, at least the elite society, is it's a society that loved puzzles, games, puns, wordplay. That's what the Skaldic poetry is about.
Yeah, very sophisticated.
And I think that anyone hearing the word berserker would think both of them simultaneously.
Yeah.
So it does. You don't have to choose about that.
Right.
The other term is the Ulf Hefner.
Right. Yeah.
They're the ones who channel wolves.
Right.
And they go in with wearing wolf skins.
Sure. So we see that in the film.
And we see that in the film.
Yeah.
But in both cases, what you have are people who are getting outside of their own bodies and who are introducing into their bodies the spirits of vicious and violent animals.
Yeah.
That allow them to do things that a normal person wouldn't do.
Absolutely. A couple of the scenes that I think are really interesting are about almost magic realist scenes in the film. And like the vision with the seeress, for example, and also where he meets with the droger. And I wonder if, those are two.
Well, why don't you tell about the droger?
Oh, the droger. Well, at one point, Amleth goes to, is it the Mound Dweller, right? Underground, and it's a haunting scene, and it could be almost from now you're done with history and you're in a magic land, like Dungeons and Dragons or something, where he's underground and he sees this skeleton, and the Draugr tells him about his future, how he will fight a big battle at the gate of hell, and that this sword is going to play a really important role.
But he has to take the sword.
Yes, in a great...
Has to win the sword from the Draugr.
And it's fabulous, the battle.
Draugrs appear in a number of the sagas. They're the Norse undead. They're not vampires because they don't suck blood. What they tend to do is, like dragons, they tend to defend hordes.
Yeah.
In this case, what we see is him fighting this undead figure. Yeah. He starts off as if he were a mummy.
Yeah.
But then he comes to life. And throughout the film, what we have is a blurring between what the audience sees as reality and what the characters think of as reality.
Right.
Which is this spirit world that they see and believe to be as real as the natural world.
Yeah, it really works. I think
It really does. Edgars underscores the fluid boundaries between the natural world and this supernatural world by having Amleth, after his victory over the undead warrior, to look back and see himself taking the sword from the seated, mummified figure. By the way, Eggers and Jean made a puzzling choice in having the sword called Droga rather than the warrior defending it. On the other hand, Amleth's placement of the decapitated head between the legs of the Draugr recalls an incident in Grettir's saga. The filmmakers really knew their sagas. There is a similar blurring of the line between the natural and the supernatural at the very end of the movie. The last thing that our hero is going to see is a Valkyrie.
Right.
Coming to take him to Valhalla.
Yeah.
It is what the Valkyries originally were before 14th century saga writers turned them into the beautiful shield maiden of what might be called saga romances. They are the seekers of the worthy dead from the battlefield to take them to either the hall of Freya or the hall of Odin.
Right.
And our hero has proven himself to be worthy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know before we recorded, we were talking about Pan's Labyrinth, blurring the real with the child's imagination. And I feel like there's parallels here.
I think so, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and great film. If you haven't seen Pan's Labyrinth, you should see it. It's both a really wonderful fantasy, a touching fantasy, and a very disturbing historical movie set in the last stages of the Spanish Civil War.
Absolutely. Is this like okay time to talk about gender?
Yes, please.
Because I think that's super interesting. Because I know in the popular imagination, it's the Brunhilde Valkyrie that's like very, very beautiful.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, these are more in the late sagas and not the original. And I think it's interesting to think about any kind of point at which there is actual, evidence for women being involved in military warfare.
And there are at least 2 Viking age graves in which were found skeletons which originally were thought to be male.
Right.
And they were thought to be male because of the grave goods, which were weapons.
Right.
One is in a high-status chamber grave in a Viking-age cemetery in Berserkir, Sweden, that was first excavated in 1878.
Yeah, that's the more famous one that just...
And the second skeleton that has since been sexed as female, buried with the sword, was excavated in southeastern Norway in 1900. As Chrissy said, the Berserkir Viking burial is pretty famous. It's one of the more magnificent Viking burials. The person was about 30 to 40 years old and of slender build. The corpse was interred with silver-trimmed clothing. It included a cap which seems to have come from Kiev, the fragment of an Arab coin, 2 horses, 1 male, 1 female, with equipment, weights, a game board, including gaming pieces and dice. The body was surrounded with weapons, including a sword, 2 spears, 25 sharp arrowheads, a battle axe, a fighting knife, and 2 shields. Although the person buried was both slender and short, and the bones showed no sign of any previous violence, archaeologists had also no doubt that this must be a male warrior. That changed in 2017 when the bones were DNA tested and turned out to be female. The published study is entitled A Female Viking Warrior Confirmed by Genomics.
Right. And so I think that's a really interesting thing. The word that a lot of people like to think about is shield maiden. And of course that's in the Vikings series.
Yes.
And we do have some written evidence, like Saxo Grammaticus. I think he does talk about Lagertha, with her hair streaming all around her, going into battle. And I think Lagertha is a major character in Vikings.
Yes.
In the show.
She's the wife of Ragnar, and she's referred to consistently as Shield Maiden.
Right.
And in fact, Vikings has things in common with the Northman, and you have 2 brothers, one brother lusting after the wife of the other brother.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a very soap
Rollo wants Lagertha as his own, and she knows he wants him, but in this case, Lagertha is going to be faithful to Ragnar because...
Until she's not, because it's the television show and there's 6 series.
And they need to do something.
Right.
6 years, you've got to do something.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. But all along, she has splendid hair. And so I feel like, this is how we, in pop culture, imagine the Valkyries and the Shield Maidens. And, of course, the Valkyries, having them be beautiful was a kind of idea in these sagas. And I think a lot of scholarship has been written on to what extent are these Valkyries really transgressing against gender norms. And over and over in the sagas where these Valkyries are beautiful, they always come back to embracing what is kind of normative ideas about how women behave. So they give up their special powers and they get married to the hero of the story. And I think that when we're talking about shield maidens, or women who actually fought in battle, from my point of view, I just think that we don't know enough yet to know how typical it was. That we have much more evidence for elite women is their involvement in magic, but also in fabric making. All of this also takes us back to this really fabulous find from the 9th century, the Augsburg burials.
Yes.
So these are burials of 2 women, and they were both elite. We know from DNA analysis what they ate, and it was good stuff. They had toothpicks. And then they also were probably associated with magic, with the practices of the Sather.
Sather, yeah.
And we know this because they were carrying around, there's a staff, a vulva staff, and we know also that the Augsburg burials have these tapestries. And these tapestries, really careful work has been done to figure out what the patterns are. And from tiny little shrouds, people have been able, really good scholars, and have been able to see, for example, a priest leading and then 3 priestesses
Yes.
following behind. And then also is this famous tree that appears over and over in the film with this one, the Oseberg tree. It's all these people that are hanging. So they're dead. They're corpses.
Trees are really important. After all, the world tree, Yggdrasil, is at the very heart of the world that extends from our world, from Middle-earth to Asgard and to Hell.
Absolutely. And the Oseberg, I think also what's interesting is how much of the fabric is destroyed. So we know fabric is one of the first things to disintegrate. And yet when scholars figured out just how many tapestries and fabric was in part of the burial, we know that it was major. And the fact that it's associated with women is also, I think, not irrelevant. So this is, getting interestingly, because there's a recent scholarship by the historian Michelle Heyer-Smith, and she wrote a book in 2020 called The Valkyrie's Loom, The Archaeology of Cloth Production and Female Power in the North Atlantic. And she looked at all these different shrouds of Viking age cloth, and found that there was a regularization of the process of weaving that happened starting in the 12th centuries. And it had a certain number of warp threads that after the 11th century, the horizontal thread, that's called the weft, just switched. And it's been marked in written sources that there's a kind of fabric called vathmal, and Icelandic law codes mention it as being currency. So that she was able to argue, I think very well, that it was women's fabric production. They were literally making money because their fabric was used as currency in Iceland and across the Viking world. It's a really cool ways of talking about women that were very powerful and yet very gendered for the mainstay, despite the fact that there is, a possibility allowed for the fact that sometimes women did participate in battle.
Really interesting points about gender, Chrissy. Really interesting. The Northman is a very masculine film. It's, in fact, one might say, it's a film about toxic Viking masculinity. Nonetheless, it has 2 strong women in it, both of whom overcome their submissive positions by acting in perfectly gendered roles, neither of whom is a warrior. We are running out of time, so here's a few parting thoughts about The Northman from the viewpoint of a historian. The first time I watched the film, I found it odd that the settlement pillaged by Amleth and his fellow berserkers was in the land of the Rus. I have no problem with the idea that an exiled Danish 12-year-old prince might go east and become a Rus Viking berserker. My problem is that the slaves taken in this raid are to be sold in Iceland. Yes, the plot requires this, otherwise Amleth could not disguise himself as a slave to be purchased by the man against whom he has sworn vengeance. But as the movie makers and the historical consultants are undoubtedly aware, slaves taken in Rus raids would have been sold to the Arab Caliphate, which had an inexhaustible demand for pagan and Christian slaves. There is no evidence I know of for Slavic slaves being transported from Eastern Europe to Iceland, and it certainly isn't supported by the recent Icelandic genome projects. Their findings show that the men who settled Iceland were predominantly of Norse ancestry, while 2/3 of the women were from the Gaelic British Isles, either from Ireland or Western Scotland. What is not present is DNA that can be traced to the Baltic or Eastern Europe. The natural inference is that the Norse who settled Iceland brought with them Irish slaves with whom they had children. I thought about this a lot. Given the filmmaker's attention to detail, I assume that Robert Eggers and especially his historical consultants would have realized this. So why place Amleth in a Rus raiding warband? I think that Eggers and Sean were willing to stretch the history in the service of the plot and in service of their goal of world building. Through the character of Olga of the Birch Forest, they could emphasize the shared shamanistic religions of early medieval Scandinavia and Eastern Europe and their shared sense of a spirit world. The Slav Olga serves the plot by being the witch woman that Amleth needs to fulfill his vengeance. This allows Eggers and Sean to balance the negative agency of the quote-unquote wicked woman, Gudrun, with the positive agency of the quote-unquote good woman, Olga. Having Amlet's love interest be a Christian Irish slave woman would have made more sense historically, but I'm not sure how it would have advanced the plot. It would have made this into a completely different film. The world of the Northmen is pagan. The only reference to Christianity comes in the scene late in the movie when Amleth begins to take his revenge by killing Fiona's retainers during the night. Fiona's grown son, Thera, awakens to find his two friends dismembered, their heads and legs and torsos rearranged in an outline of a horse and pinned to the roof of their hut. Thora shrieks in rage and horror, blaming the atrocity on quote-unquote Christian swine. Terrified, another man asks, quote, "Could it be the Christians? Their god is a corpse nailed to a tree," end quote. But another of Thora's companions points out that the corpse parts have been arranged to form an 8-legged horse. In other words, Odin's mount Sleipnir. Iceland was not converted to Christianity until around 1000 CE, and the Christians on Fiona's farm would all have been slaves. One of the more historically clever moves of the filmmakers was to set the second half of the story in the year 915. This was a conscious decision by Eggers. In an interview on the excellent Viking podcast Saga Thing, which I really recommend, the hosts of that podcast challenged Eggers about the absence of legal actions in the movie. Legal disputes in the Thing, the Assembly of Freemen, play a critical role in the family sagas of the Icelanders, which the movie becomes. But The Northman is a pure tale of vengeance in which lawyers, like Njal of Njal's saga, play no role. Eggers and Sean were aware of this, which is why they set the movie in 915, 15 years before the establishment of the Icelandic Althing. This is the kind of attention to detail that I really admire. I was really hoping that we could squeeze in a discussion of recent popular television shows about Vikings, and maybe even some video games, but we are running out of time, and perhaps it would be best to hold that for another episode.
We could probably talk about this for a long time, but other people have other things to do. Maybe their trips on their car rides are over by now. We're
also recording this on Super Bowl Sunday, and if Chrissy doesn't leave now, she's not going to get home in time for the kickoff.
We're more interested in Knocklunger than in football. Oh my.
Yeah. Although I really liked the episode on what we do in the shadows about the Super Bowl.
I didn't see that one. Is
they
the second
misread
season?
it as the Superb Owl, which they thought was wonderful.
Yeah, that is excellent.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you for joining us, and the next episode I think is going to be on the man who actually was able to defeat Vikings, Alfred the Great.
Your guy.
My guy.
Alfred.
And Ellen will rejoin me for that one. But I'd like to thank my guest and co-host, Chrissy. That was fun, Chrissy.
Oh my goodness, Richard. Thank you so much for having me.
And I'm hoping that you'll come again in the future for another of these.
It would be delightful.
Okay,
yes.
great.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye for now.